Hello, and welcome to Creepy Raindrops. Before you drift off to sleep, let me tell you a story that will help you relax and fall into a deep, peaceful slumber. Sit or lie down comfortably, and let the world around you slowly fade away. Tonight, I will take you on a journey through the woods, where the air is cool and the shadows of the trees stretch long. As you listen, let your mind relax, your body feel heavy, and all the noise in your head gradually fade away. Before we begin, I'd like to know, which city are you listening to this story from? And what time is it there? Close your eyes if you haven't already, and let this story guide you into a restful, deep sleep. I went hiking in the Oregon forest. Something stalked me, but I never saw it. It was late October, just as the fall chill started to settle over the Pacific Northwest. I'd been craving some alone time, and the quiet isolation of the Oregon forest seemed like the perfect escape. My name's Sarah, and I'm an avid hiker, always looking for new trails to explore. This time, I decided to head into the Willamette National Forest, which, despite its beauty, has always carried an air of mystery. The locals often spoke of it with hushed tones, hinting at the strangeness that lurked within, but I didn't put much stock in local legends. I was there for the adventure, not for ghost stories. I arrived at the trailhead around 9 a.m. The morning fog still hung low over the trees, and the air had that damp, earthy scent that only a forest can have. The sun was barely peeking through the canopy, casting long, spindly shadows across the narrow path ahead of me. It was the kind of day that could easily turn eerie, but I didn't mind. I'd hiked in worse conditions. As I walked deeper into the forest, the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves filled my ears. But there was something different today. The further I went, the quieter it got. It wasn't that the forest was silent. It was more like the sounds were muffled, as though they were being swallowed by the thick fog. By noon, I had covered several miles and was starting to feel the isolation. No other hikers had passed me, and I hadn't seen any sign of life other than a few squirrels and distant birds. The path wound up into the hills, becoming steeper and more rugged as I went on. I checked my map. There was a small overlook just ahead, a place where I planned to stop for lunch. I pushed forward, eager to reach it. As I neared the overlook, I felt it. A strange sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. At first, I chalked it up to the usual feeling of being alone in the woods, but it grew stronger. I turned around, but there was no one in sight, just the fog and the tall, looming trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was following me. I shrugged it off and reached the overlook, a small clearing with a view of the valley below. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing a patch of blue sky, and I decided to take a break. I sat on a large rock, unpacked my lunch, and tried to ignore the unease creeping up on me. But it wasn't long before I heard it. A soft crunch of leaves behind me, faint but unmistakable. I froze. My heart raced, and I turned slowly, expecting to see a hiker who had finally caught up with me. But there was no one there. I stood up, scanning the trees around me, but nothing. No movement. The forest was still. Maybe I was just overreacting, I thought. After all, I was alone in a dense forest, and the sounds of nature could play tricks on your mind. I continued eating, but the feeling didn't go away. The crunch of leaves behind me grew more frequent, and I could almost feel the presence drawing closer. I stood up quickly, my breath catching in my throat, and once again, I scanned the surroundings. The trail was empty. I stepped forward cautiously, my eyes darting from one tree to the next, but nothing seemed out of place. Trying to calm myself, I told myself it was just the forest playing tricks. Maybe an animal was nearby, or perhaps the wind was shifting and making the ground rustle. But that didn't explain the odd sense that someone was watching me closely. I decided to press on. My stomach churned, and I began walking faster, eager to leave the clearing behind. But the crunching sounds started again, this time much closer. I turned sharply, but still no one was there. My mind raced. It had to be an animal, I convinced myself. There was no other explanation. I hurried down the trail, keeping my eyes fixed on the path ahead. But the sounds kept following me. Every time I stopped, they stopped. Every time I picked up my pace, the crunching followed suit. It was as if whatever was behind me was mirroring my every move, just out of sight. As the afternoon wore on, the sun began to dip lower in the sky, and the fog returned, thicker than before. The trail seemed to stretch on endlessly, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just behind me, always staying just out of view. My legs were aching, but I couldn't stop moving. The woods had become oppressive, suffocating, as though they were closing in around me. I knew the trail would loop back to the trailhead eventually, but I wasn't sure how far away that was. At one point, I glanced over my shoulder and saw something. It was quick, like a flash of movement between the trees. My heart pounded in my chest as I spun around, expecting to see a person or animal. But again, nothing. Just the darkening forest and the distant sound of leaves shifting in the wind. I started to run, but the crunching followed. It was close now, so close I could feel it, like something was breathing down my neck. I could hear the footsteps matching mine. So perfectly it was as if whatever was stalking me was right there, just beyond the trees. My breath was shallow, my pulse quick, and every nerve in my body screamed at me to run faster, to get away. But there was nowhere to go. And then, I saw it. A flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure, just a silhouette, standing between two massive trees. It wasn't human. It didn't move like a person. The form was tall, almost unnaturally so, and it stood perfectly still, staring at me. I froze. My heart stopped in my chest. But when I blinked, it was gone. I turned and ran, faster than I ever had before, not daring to look back. The crunching continued, but the figure was nowhere to be seen. I don't know how long I ran. Minutes? Hours? All I could focus on was the path ahead and the terrifying feeling that something was chasing me. Eventually, I burst out of the trees and back onto the main trail, where I saw a group of hikers passing by. They stopped when they saw my panicked expression. "Are you okay?" one of them asked. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I just nodded quickly, unable to form a coherent thought. The forest behind me was silent once again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly empty. I didn't stay to chat. I just kept walking, almost at a jog, until I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car parked where I had left it. The sun had set, and the sky was dark, but the woods seemed even darker. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in those woods. Was it a person playing a prank? An animal? Or something else entirely? But one thing is certain. I will never go back to the Oregon forest, not after what I felt watching me, stalking me, just out of sight. For days after my hike, I tried to shake the experience off. My mind kept returning to that moment in the woods when I saw the figure, or what I thought was a figure. I told myself it was a trick of the light, or perhaps my imagination had run wild from being alone in the forest for too long. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The nightmares began almost immediately. They were the same each night. Me walking through the forest, the eerie quiet enveloping me, then hearing the crunching of leaves behind me. Always behind me, never in front. Sometimes I would look back, and the figure would be there, just standing motionless between the trees, watching me. But every time I blinked, it was gone. One night, I woke up drenched in sweat, heart racing, gasping for air. I looked around my dark bedroom, my pulse pounding in my ears. The house was still, nothing unusual. But then, from the corner of my eye, I caught a fleeting shadow dart past the window. My breath caught. My heart skipped a beat. I rushed to the window and looked out into the yard. Nothing. Just the blackness of the night and the stillness of the trees. I tried to dismiss it. It was probably a raccoon or some other animal. But something told me it wasn't. A few days later, I was walking downtown when I overheard a conversation between two locals. They were talking about strange occurrences in the Oregon forest. I was drawn in immediately. They were mentioning things. Figures that appeared and disappeared between trees, footsteps that echoed in the distance but never had anyone to make them. The feeling of being watched, even when no one was around. They say the forest's haunted. One of them said, "Old legends, you know. The natives believed something watches over that land. Something that never lets you leave." The words sent a cold shiver down my spine. I didn't know if I wanted to hear more or run the other way, but I couldn't stop listening. The older man continued, "Not everyone who enters the forest makes it out, you know. And if they do, they don't leave the same. A few folks, they say, got changed somehow. Never the same after their trips into those woods. Some of them even go missing." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I had heard of spooky stories about haunted forests before, but this felt different. This felt real. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the man's words, and how it seemed so eerily familiar. My heart raced as my mind replayed the events of that day. The feeling of being followed, the shadow I'd seen in the corner of my eye, the strange sensation that something was just behind me in the trees, even though I couldn't see it. The next morning, I decided to do some research. I dug through old records and articles online about the Oregon forest, specifically the Willamette National Forest. To my shock, I found stories of strange disappearances and unexplained phenomena in the area, some dating back to the early 1900s. There were accounts of hikers who had vanished without a trace, others who had claimed to hear whispers in the trees, and even some who spoke of seeing shadowy figures moving through the forest, only for them to vanish the moment they tried to approach. What stood out to me, however, was the consistent mention of a particular area of the forest, an old, overgrown trail that no one had used in years. It was said to be cursed. Some called it the Hollow Path. Locals warned never to step foot on that trail, but no one ever explained why. I couldn't stop thinking about the trail, or about what I had experienced in the forest. Had I unknowingly wandered too close to the Hollow Path? Was that what had been following me? That afternoon, I called up a local park ranger to inquire about the trail. I was expecting a vague answer, something along the lines of, "It's just an old path. Don't worry about it." But instead, the ranger's voice dropped low when I mentioned it. "You don't want to go near that place, ma'am," he said. "Not unless you want to get tangled up in something you don't understand. It's an old trail, sure, but people who've gone there, they don't come back the same. Or they don't come back at all." His voice was tight, almost as if he had seen things he couldn't explain. "We've had reports of hikers getting lost around that area. The fog rolls in thick, and the trees seem to close in on you. Some folks get the feeling that they're being watched, even though no one's there. Others claim to hear things, voices whispering their names. I'd stay far away from it if I were you." I thanked him, though his words only added to the gnawing sense of dread that had been building inside me since I left the forest. That night, I lay awake in bed, the sound of distant wind outside my window. I couldn't stop thinking about the hollow path, the shadowy figure I'd seen, and the feeling of being followed. What was it, and why was I still haunted by it? The next day, despite every instinct telling me to stay away, I made up my mind. I would return to the Oregon forest. I had to know what happened to me out there, why I felt so certain that something had been following me, why I still heard those faint crunching footsteps, even when I was safe at home. But this time, I wouldn't be going alone. I called my friend Ben, who was an experienced hiker, and convinced him to join me. I needed someone else with me, someone who could see things from a different perspective. We agreed to meet the following weekend. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but deep down, I knew that I couldn't move on without going back. Something had been left unfinished, and if I didn't confront it, I'd never be able to live with the fear that still clung to me. As the weekend approached, the dread in my chest grew heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me out there, in the woods. The forest wasn't finished with me yet. Saturday morning arrived, and Ben and I met up at the trailhead around 8 a.m. The air was crisp, the sky clear, with sunlight streaming through the trees, casting long shadows across the path. The forest looked beautiful, calm, serene even. It felt like any other hike, but I could sense the tension in the air, a palpable weight that made the trees seem just a little too close, the shadows a little too long. We began the hike in silence, with Ben leading the way. He had been to Oregon before, but never to this part of the forest. I was already anxious, but I didn't want to let him know how much the place unnerved me. I kept my eyes ahead, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different this time. It wasn't the same quiet I remembered. There was a subtle hum in the air, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. As we trekked deeper into the forest, I couldn't help but feel the pull of that old trail, the one I had read about, the hollow path. I couldn't stop thinking about it, wondering if I had unknowingly crossed it last time, if that was the source of the shadowy figure I had seen, the crunching footsteps that mirrored my own, the eerie feeling of being watched. Ben noticed my distracted mood. "You okay?" he asked, his voice cutting through the quiet of the forest. I glanced over at him, trying to shake off the tension that was building in my chest. "Yeah, just thinking about something," I replied, though I didn't elaborate. The last thing I wanted to do was worry him with my irrational fears. We kept walking, but the further we went, the more unsettled I became. The forest around us seemed to close in, the trees growing taller and more densely packed, casting even more shadows. The air was thick with humidity, and the smell of damp earth hung heavily around us. And then, as we rounded a bend in the trail, I saw it. A narrow, overgrown path branching off to the left. It was almost hidden, barely visible through the dense undergrowth. But there was something about it that immediately drew me in. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized it for what it was, the hollow path. I felt a chill race down my spine. Without saying a word, I stepped toward it. Ben, noticing my hesitation, caught up with me. "Sarah, what are you doing? That doesn't look like a safe trail." But I was already moving. Something was pulling me toward it, an undeniable force. The path seemed to stretch into the dark, twisting woods like an invitation or a warning. "I just want to see it," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "just to know if it's real." Ben looked hesitant, but after a moment, he sighed and followed me. "Fine, but we're not going too far in." I barely heard him as I stepped onto the hollow path. The air here felt different, stale and heavy, like the forest had held its breath for years, waiting for someone to pass through. The trees on either side of the trail seemed to loom, their gnarled branches reaching out, their twisted shapes almost as if they were alive. The path wound down into a small, shadowy hollow, where the fog seemed to cling to the ground, creeping like fingers of smoke over the damp earth. We continued, the only sounds our footsteps on the soft, moss-covered ground and the occasional rustle of leaves. But the deeper we went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of the forest, birdsong, the wind rustling through the branches were gone. It felt like the entire world had vanished, leaving only us, the trees, and an oppressive silence. "Sarah," Ben said, his voice tense, "this doesn't feel right." I could hear the unease in his voice. I looked over at him and saw that his face was pale, his eyes wide as he scanned the trees around us. I could tell he felt it too, the presence, the feeling that something was watching us, just beyond the edge of our vision. I nodded, my throat dry. "Yeah, I know. Let's just keep going a little further." The path ahead seemed to stretch on, but it felt endless, like we were walking deeper into a maze that had no end. And then, just as I was about to suggest we turn back, I heard it. The same soft crunching sound I had heard on my last hike, far behind us, but unmistakable. It was the sound of footsteps, walking in perfect time with ours, keeping pace, but when I looked over my shoulder, there was nothing there. I froze. Ben stopped too, and I could see the fear in his eyes. "Sarah, you hear that, right?" I nodded, my breath catching in my throat. The crunching stopped. It was like the woods were listening, waiting for something to happen. And then, just as suddenly, the sound of leaves shifting started again, this time closer, just beyond the trees. My heart raced as I turned around, expecting to see something, anything, but the woods were empty, still, silent. "Let's get out of here," Ben said urgently, grabbing my arm. Couldn't argue. I wanted to leave, but it felt like the forest wasn't going to let us go so easily. The path behind us had become shrouded in a thick fog, and the air had grown heavy with an unnatural chill. We turned to leave, but the crunching was following us, growing louder and more distinct. Every time I stopped, it stopped. Every time I quickened my pace, it did too. I couldn't take it anymore. My legs were shaking as I ran, pushing through the thick underbrush, Ben close behind me. We could hear the sound of our own footsteps, mixed with the unnatural mirrored crunching that followed us. Just as I thought we were about to break free, the air shifted, and I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A figure, tall and dark, standing just beyond the fog. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, its eyes on me. I spun around to face it, but as quickly as I had seen it, it was gone, swallowed by the fog. We didn't stop. We ran, crashing through the trees, breathless and terrified, not daring to look back. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we burst out of the hollow path and onto the main trail. The fog began to lift, and the sounds of the forest returned to normal. Birds singing, the wind rustling the leaves. The crunching footsteps were gone. Ben and I stood there, panting, staring at each other in disbelief. "Did that just happen?" he asked, voice shaky. I didn't know how to answer. I could still hear the crunching in my ears, feel the cold presence of the thing that had stalked us. The forest had let us go, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly escaped. We didn't speak another word as we hurried back to the trailhead, and neither of us dared to look behind us. We had no idea what we had encountered that day, but we both knew one thing for certain: we would never return to the Oregon forest again. Not after what we had felt, what we had heard, and what we had seen. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind rustles the trees outside my window, I still hear it. The crunching of footsteps, just behind me, always just out of view. And I know it's still out there, waiting. Weeks passed after that horrifying experience, but the unsettling feeling didn't fade. It followed me home like a shadow, lingering in the corners of my mind, creeping into my dreams. No matter how hard I tried to distract myself, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't truly alone. Ben and I barely spoke about what happened. We both knew we couldn't make sense of it, so we didn't try. We just pretended like it was another strange experience, something we could brush off. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just in our heads. Something had been in the forest that day. Something that had followed us, something that wasn't human. Then one evening, a few weeks later, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I was sitting in my living room, scrolling through my phone, when I received a message from Ben. It was simple, just a few words. Asterisk, we need to talk. Meet me tomorrow. Asterisk. My stomach tightened. I hadn't heard from him in a while. Not since we'd gone back to the forest. Something in the message made me uneasy, like he was reaching out for a reason he couldn't quite put into words. The next day, I met him at a small cafe in town, both of us silent for a long while before he finally spoke. I had a dream last night, Ben began, looking down at his coffee, his hands trembling slightly. The same one I had after we left the forest. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't told him about the dreams I'd been having. The ones where the figure followed me, the crunching footsteps always close, always just behind. But now, hearing him mention the same dream, I felt the cold grip of fear tighten around my chest. The dream was vivid, he continued, his voice shaking. I was back on the hollow path. But this time it was different. I could hear the footsteps, but they weren't just behind me. They were all around me. And then I saw it. That thing. It was standing in front of me, watching me. Its eyes were dark, like pools of shadow. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. Ben's voice trailed off, and I could see the terror in his eyes. My own stomach churned as I thought about the last time I had seen that figure in the forest. The way it felt like it was waiting for me. The way it had disappeared the moment I turned to face it. I woke up, he said, but the thing wasn't gone. It was in my room, in the corner, standing still, just like it had been in the forest. I swear I felt its presence. I sat there, stunned, unable to speak. This wasn't just a coincidence. Whatever we had encountered in the woods hadn't been left behind. It had followed us. It was still with us. Ben looked up at me, his eyes wide. I don't know what it is, Sarah, but I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, just waiting for us. I nodded slowly, my mind reeling. The forest had always felt like a place of mystery. A place where the boundaries between the living and the unknown were thin. But this was different. This was something that wasn't bound by the forest. It had crossed over into our world. That night, I went home, and the silence of my apartment felt oppressive, suffocating. I couldn't escape the image of that dark figure, its eyes empty and endless, watching me. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. The crunching of footsteps echoed in my mind, as if it was following me, just like it had followed Ben. Around 2 a.m., I woke with a start. The house was eerily still, but something felt off. My skin prickled, and a cold draft swept through the room, despite the windows being shut. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, trying to shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. That's when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible crunch came from outside. I held my breath, straining to listen. The crunching was faint at first, like leaves or twigs breaking underfoot, but it was rhythmic, deliberate, and it was close. I stood up, heart racing, and walked quietly to the window. My mind screamed at me to ignore it, to stay inside and not look, but I couldn't resist. I pulled back the curtains just enough to peer out into the yard. There was nothing, just the dark night and the trees swaying in the wind. But the crunching continued, now louder, more distinct, like footsteps slowly approaching the house. I backed away from the window, my breath shallow. I had to be imagining it. It had to be an animal, a raccoon, or something else. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was no animal. It was the same presence I had felt in the forest, the same watching, waiting thing. I grabbed my phone and texted Ben, asking if he had heard anything. His reply came almost immediately. Asterisk, I heard it too. Asterisk. My blood ran cold. There was no denying it now. Whatever we had encountered in the Oregon forest hadn't been a one-time event. It was following us, crossing into our lives, infecting everything we knew. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. The crunching never stopped. Not once. It seemed to circle the house, pacing just out of sight, always staying just beyond the reach of my view. And when dawn finally broke, it stopped. But I knew it wasn't gone. It was waiting. The next day, Ben and I made a decision. We had to confront this, whatever it was. We couldn't keep running, pretending it was a figment of our imagination. We had to return to the forest, to the hollow path, and end this once and for all. We didn't know what we were up against, but we knew that the forest hadn't finished with us yet. And if we didn't face it, whatever it was, it might never leave us in peace. We gathered our gear, preparing for the inevitable return to the forest. And as we headed back to the trailhead, I couldn't shake the thought that we weren't just walking into the woods. We were walking into something far darker, something that had been waiting for us all along. I could feel its presence already, and I knew, deep down, I had no choice but to face it. Ben and I drove to the trailhead early the next morning. The air was crisp, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The woods felt different this time, darker, more oppressive. It was as if the forest itself was aware of our return, anticipating our steps with a quiet, unspoken dread. Neither of us spoke as we gathered our gear. There was no need. We both knew why we were here. We knew we had to confront whatever was in that forest. The strange thing we had felt, seen, on the hollow path was still out there, and it wasn't going to let us go easily. The moment we stepped onto the trail, the woods swallowed us whole. The sun barely pierced the thick canopy above, leaving us in half-light, shadows stretching long across the narrow path. It felt like we were walking into a different world, one where time didn't quite work the same way, and where things that should be impossible could exist. We made our way to the same path we had taken the first time, the hollow path. Ben kept glancing over at me, but I couldn't bring myself to meet his eyes. My thoughts were consumed by what awaited us. The crunching, the figure, the heavy feeling of being watched. Every step seemed to echo in the silence, and with each footfall, the oppressive stillness deepened. As we walked deeper into the woods, I noticed that the usual forest sounds, the wind rustling through the trees, the calls of birds in the distance, were gone. It was as if the forest itself had fallen silent, holding its breath. The only sound was our footsteps, and even those seemed muffled, like the earth itself was trying to absorb them. "Do you feel that?" Ben's voice cut through the silence, barely above a whisper. I nodded, even though I hadn't spoken a word. I felt it too. That same sensation, the one that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The feeling of being watched. The sense that something was just behind us, always a step away from being seen. We reached the entrance to the hollow path, and the air around us seemed to change. It was colder here, the fog thicker, wrapping itself around the trees like a living thing. I could barely see a few feet in front of me, the world reduced to shadows and mist. "This is it," I said, my voice sounding small in the vast emptiness. "We have to go in." Ben hesitated. I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear that had been gnawing at me for weeks. But we had no choice. We were already in too deep. We stepped onto the path, and the world around us seemed to close in. The trees pressed closer together, their gnarled branches creating a canopy that blocked out the little light that had been filtering through. The The path twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the heart of the forest. I couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were watching us, that the very earth beneath our feet was alive with something we couldn't understand. The crunching started again. At first, it was faint, distant, as if it were just a trick of the wind or the rustling of branches. But then it grew louder, closer, the sound of footsteps, deliberate, measured, moving in perfect rhythm with ours. I couldn't tell if it was real, if I was imagining it, or if something in the forest was toying with us. I stopped. Ben stopped too, his face pale, his breath shallow. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the steady crunch of leaves. I couldn't answer. My throat felt tight, as though something had lodged itself there. I looked around, trying to see what was making the sound, but there was nothing. The fog hung heavy, obscuring the trees and the path ahead. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a dark figure, standing motionless between the trees. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its presence. It was watching us, and I knew with every fiber of my being that it had been following us from the moment we stepped onto the trail. Ben saw it too. I could see the fear in his eyes as he grabbed my arm. "Sarah, we need to leave. Now." But something kept me rooted to the spot. The figure was still there, just beyond the mist, its shadow stretching like a dark stain on the forest floor. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my legs wouldn't move. My body felt frozen, trapped in the thick, suffocating air. The footsteps kept moving, growing louder, closer, until I could feel them in my chest, as though the very ground beneath my feet was trembling. The figure didn't move, but its presence was all-encompassing. Felt like it was everywhere, pressing in on us from all sides. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. The crunching stopped. The figure vanished. Ben and I stood there, breathless, heart pounding in our chests. I could feel the sweat running down my back, my body trembling from the fear that had surged through me. I turned to Ben, but he was staring ahead, his face pale and stricken. "Do you see that?" he whispered. I turned to follow his gaze. In the distance, just beyond the fog, there was something moving, a shadow, a flicker of movement. At first, I thought it was just the wind, the mist playing tricks on my eyes. But then it shifted again, more deliberately this time. It was moving toward us. I felt my pulse spike, my heart racing. Whatever it wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't the fog. It was real, and it was coming closer. Ben grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the edge of the path. "We need to go now," he hissed, his voice trembling. I didn't need any more convincing. I turned and ran, Ben close behind me. The path blurred as we sprinted, my legs aching with each step, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The crunching footsteps returned, now louder than ever, right behind us, echoing through the fog as if the thing was right at our heels. We didn't stop until we burst out of the hollow path and back onto the main trail, gasping for air, hearts pounding. The forest seemed to release its grip on us, the oppressive feeling lifting just a little, but I knew we weren't safe. Not really. We didn't speak as we walked quickly back to the trailhead, both of us too shaken to say anything. I could feel its presence still, a cold weight pressing on my chest, and every time I glanced over my shoulder, I half expected to see the shadowy figure standing just beyond the trees, waiting for us to look away. But this time it didn't follow. Not physically, at least. I knew it was still there. I could feel it. We made it back to the car in silence, neither of us daring to speak. The forest had given us a glimpse of something far darker than we had imagined. And as we drove away, I could still hear it, the faint, distant crunching of footsteps, as if the forest was still calling us back. But this time, we didn't look back. We couldn't, and I had no idea what would happen next. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever had been waiting for us in the Oregon forest wasn't done with us yet. The drive back felt like an eternity. The road stretched out before us in an endless ribbon, but it felt like we were trapped in a loop, constantly running, never truly escaping. The forest was still with us, in the air, in our minds. We both knew that no matter how far we drove, no matter how far we distanced ourselves physically, we were still connected to that place. "I don't think it's over," Ben finally spoke, his voice low and tense, as if he feared saying it aloud would make it worse. Whatever it was, whatever we saw, is still out there. It knows us. I didn't answer. What could I say? He was right, and I had no way of explaining what was happening. How do you explain something that defies all logic, all reason? How do you explain a presence that cannot be seen, but is felt in every breath you take, in every creak of the floorboard, in every whisper of the wind? We both stayed silent for the rest of the drive, lost in our own thoughts, haunted by the same images. The shadowy figure in the forest, the footsteps that echoed from the trees, the crushing weight of being watched. By the time we reached my apartment, the sun had set, leaving the world bathed in a dull, unnatural twilight. I wasn't ready to face the reality of being back home. In the safety of the familiar, the comfort of four walls, the terror of the forest should have faded. But it didn't. It had only grown stronger, more present. I felt its weight every time I moved, every time I stepped through a doorway. It followed me like a shadow that had seeped into my skin, waiting for the perfect moment to make itself known again. Ben dropped me off at my apartment, but I didn't want him to leave. "Stay," I said, almost pleading, my voice trembling with the fear that had gripped me. "Please, just for tonight." He hesitated, glancing at the darkness that stretched out beyond the streetlights, and then nodded. "Okay, we'll stick together. I don't want to be alone either." We went inside, and I locked every door, checked every window, as if the simple act of securing my apartment would somehow shield me from whatever was lurking just beyond the edge of the world. But I knew deep down that nothing could protect us. Not from it. As we settled on the couch, I couldn't help but glance at the windows, my eyes flicking nervously from corner to corner. The faintest creak from the ceiling above made my heart skip a beat. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the building settling. But the more I tried to push the fear away, the stronger it became. I had to ask, "Do you think it followed us here? Like, into the city?" Ben rubbed his temples, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and dread. "I don't know, but I can't shake the feeling that it's waiting, watching us." That night, sleep came fitfully. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of the shadowy figure in the woods haunted my dreams. I would wake up in a cold sweat, gasping for air, heart pounding in my chest. Each time, I'd glance around the room, expecting to see those dark eyes staring back at me from the shadows. But there was nothing. The third time I woke up, I didn't hear anything. The apartment was still, too still, but the air felt wrong. There was a coldness in the room that hadn't been there before. I sat up, looking over at Ben. He was still asleep on the couch, his face relaxed in a peaceful expression that felt foreign considering everything that had happened. But something in the silence felt unnatural. There was no noise, no cars driving by, no sounds of people talking, nothing at all. And then I heard it, the faintest sound, like the scuffling of feet on the floor. It came from the hallway. I held my breath, straining to listen. My pulse quickened, and my hands began to shake. I slowly got up from the couch, careful not to wake Ben. The sound came again, closer this time, unmistakable. It was footsteps, slow and deliberate, just like before. My body moved on instinct, and I crept toward the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the moon shining through the windows. I reached the hallway and stopped. I didn't want to go any further, but I couldn't turn back now. Whatever it was here, and I needed to know what it was. I moved closer to the source of the sound, my breath shallow. The footsteps stopped, and then there was a whisper, low and guttural, as if the words were being dragged out from deep within the earth. I couldn't make out what it said, but it didn't matter. I knew it was speaking directly to me. Sarah. The voice was cold, like ice running down my spine. It was familiar, but not in a comforting way. I had never heard that voice before, but somehow I knew it was the same presence from the forest, the same thing that had stalked us. Sarah, come back. The words were more like a command than a plea. I could feel the power behind them, pulling at me, like the forest itself was calling me back to the place where it had all started. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. I took a step forward, toward the sound of the voice. But as I did, a shadow moved in front of me. I froze. It wasn't Ben. It wasn't anyone I recognized. The figure in the hallway was tall, its form barely visible in the darkness. But I could see its eyes, dark, unblinking, empty pools that seemed to swallow all light. I stepped closer. I couldn't move. And then, in a voice that chilled me to my core, it whispered, "You're not safe here." The voice echoed in my mind, reverberating against the walls of my chest as if it were inside me, making my heart stutter in its beat. "You're not safe here," it whispered again, each word pulling me deeper into a cold, paralyzing fear. The figure in the hallway hadn't moved, but I could feel its presence closing in around me. It was like the air itself had thickened, pressing in on my lungs. I tried to scream, to call out to Ben, but no sound came from my throat. My mouth was dry, my body frozen in place, the terror of the moment sinking deeper into my bones. The figure took another step forward, and in the dim light of the hallway, I could now make out its shape more clearly. Tall, thin, impossibly still, its long limbs unnaturally elongated. And those eyes, those dark, unfeeling eyes, they were fixed on me. Without thinking, I turned and bolted back to the living room, my feet slapping against the hardwood floor. My hands scrambled for the door, my fingers slick with sweat as I fumbled with the lock, the sound of my breathing deafening in my own ears. I managed to wrench the door open, my body flying outside without another thought. I stood on the balcony, gasping for air, the cool night air rushing into my lungs. The city was still quiet, but I knew, it was still there, the thing from the forest, the thing that had followed us. It wasn't finished with me. I heard the door open behind me, and Ben stepped out, looking disoriented and confused. His face was pale, his hair mussed from sleep. "Sarah?" he whispered, his voice groggy. But then his eyes narrowed in concern as he saw my panicked expression. "What's going on?" I couldn't speak. My mind raced, every part of me screaming to explain what had happened. But the words felt trapped, locked away behind the terror that surged through my veins. The shadow, its eyes, its presence, was still fresh in my mind, and I was sure I hadn't imagined it. My voice cracked, and I had to swallow the lump in my throat. "Ben, it's here. It's in the apartment. It spoke to me." He frowned, taking a step closer, as if to reassure me. "What do you mean? What spoke to you?" I shook my head, the words failing to come out the way I needed them to. The shadow, the voice, the feeling of being completely helpless. Everything had collided into a whirlwind of fear that I couldn't seem to process. It said I wasn't safe here, and it's still out there, My voice trembled with each syllable, but I couldn't stop. Ben, it followed us. It followed me home. Ben's expression softened, his protective instincts kicking in. He moved toward me and placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch grounding me just a little. "We're gonna figure this out," he said, his voice steady. "We'll figure out what's going on. Okay?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure how much comfort I found in his words. He wasn't the one who had heard the voice, who had seen the thing standing in the dark. But I could see the concern in his eyes. He wasn't gonna leave me alone, and I was grateful for that. I didn't want to face whatever this was on my own. We stood there in silence for a long while, the tension in the air thick, as if the whole world was holding its breath. The shadow, the thing from the forest, was still somewhere nearby, lurking just beyond the edges of the apartment. I could feel it in the quiet, feel it in the way the air seemed to press heavier against my skin. Ben turned and gestured toward the living room. "Let's go inside. We need to figure out what's going on." I followed him reluctantly, my eyes scanning the hallway as we passed, half expecting to see the shadow flicker in the corner of my vision. But there was nothing. The apartment was empty, just as it should have been. But I knew better now. We sat back on the couch, but the sense of unease never left. My thoughts were spinning. Had it really spoken to me? Was I imagining things? But no. The presence had been too real. The voice had been too clear. I could still hear the echo of it in my mind, still feel the pull of it, like a thread drawing me back to the forest. "I don't think it's just in the forest," I said, my voice quiet but steady. I think it's attached to us now. To me." Ben stared at me, his expression pained. "But how? How can that be?" "I don't know," I whispered. "I don't understand any of this. But I feel it, Ben. It's here. In the apartment. In the air. It's waiting for something." A long silence stretched between us, both of us lost in our thoughts, trying to make sense of something that defied all logic. How could we go on with our lives when we were being hunted by something so unnatural, so inexplicable? How could we ever feel safe again? And then I heard it, the faintest sound, like a footstep, or maybe it was just the wind, but it was enough to make my heart skip in my chest. I wasn't sure anymore. I wasn't sure of anything. I stood up, moving toward the door. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know where I could go to escape this feeling. Maybe there was nowhere to go. Maybe I was already too far gone, too connected to the thing in the forest, too tangled in its grasp. "Sarah?" Ben's voice snapped me back to reality. "What are you doing?" "I need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I can't stay here. Not anymore." Ben followed me, his face full of confusion and fear. "No, you can't just..." But before he could finish, the door slammed shut. Something or someone was standing on the other side. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was outside, but this time, it wasn't just a shadow. It was solid, a presence made real. I could feel it pressing against the door, a cold, dark energy radiating from it. And then, in a voice that sent shivers down my spine, it spoke again. The voice outside the door was barely a whisper, but it carried with it an undeniable weight, a pull, like an invisible string wrapping around my chest, tugging me toward it. "Come back." I didn't move. Ben was at my side, eyes wide, mouth slightly open in disbelief. "Sarah, we need to leave. Now." His voice cracked with urgency, his hand reaching for my arm. But I couldn't bring myself to turn away from the door. It was real. I knew it was real. This thing, this presence from the forest, it had followed us here. The voice was the same, cold and insistent, but now it was closer, tangible, pressing against the very fabric of the apartment. I could feel it in my bones, vibrating through the floor, through the walls. And then, there was a sound from the hallway, soft, like the scraping of nails on wood. Slow, deliberate. I turned my head, heart pounding. The sound stopped. Ben grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the window. "We have to go, Sarah. Whatever this is, we can't face it here. We can't stay." I couldn't bring myself to argue. My body was frozen, my mind screaming at me to run, to escape, but my feet wouldn't move. The shadow that had stalked us in the forest, that had followed us here, it wasn't just something that could be outrun. It wasn't something you could escape from. But maybe, just maybe, we could fight it. I glanced back at Ben. His eyes were frantic, but there was something else there now. A glimmer of resolve, as though he knew we couldn't just cower in fear forever. We had to confront it. We had no other choice. "Do you have your phone?" I asked, my voice trembling but steady. Ben pulled it from his pocket, his hands shaking as he handed it to me. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to call someone," I said, the words sounding foreign in my mouth. "Someone who might know what's happening. Someone who can help us." I dialed the number with shaky fingers, my heart still racing. I had no idea who to call. Who could possibly understand what we were going through? Who could explain what this thing was? But there was only one person I could think of. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Sarah?" It was Sarah. Not me. Another Sarah. A woman who I had met years ago, someone who had helped me in the past with strange things, things I hadn't been able to explain at the time, things I had long since tried to forget. "Sarah, I need your help," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice steady, as though she'd been expecting this call all along. "I don't know how to explain it," I said, my mind racing. But something followed me, from the forest, from that hike in Oregon. I think it's in my apartment now. It's watching us. Spoke to me. There was a pause on the other end. I could hear Sarah's breath, but there was no judgment, no disbelief, just the sound of a woman who had seen too much. "I knew it was coming for you," Sarah said softly. "I've been tracking it. I've been waiting for you to call." What? My breath caught in my throat. "You knew? How? What is it?" "It's not just a thing, Sarah." Sarah's voice grew more serious, more urgent. "It's a presence. Something ancient. It's a manifestation of the forest itself, of all the things that can't be explained, that have never been understood. It's connected to the land, and when you stepped onto that path, you marked yourself. It's been following you ever since." My head spun. A manifestation of the forest? It didn't make sense. None of this did. "But why me? Why now?" Sarah sighed. "Because you're the one who saw it. You're the one who made contact with it. And now it's bound to you." There was a cold, dead silence in my chest. Bound to me, the words echoed in my mind, and I felt something shift. Something dark. Something heavy that settled deep into my bones. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had already been marked long before I even set foot on the hollow path. "Is there a way to stop it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Yes," Sarah replied, "but it won't be easy. You'll need to face it. Face it. The way you see it, the way it communicates with you, that's the key. It won't go away until you understand what it is and what it wants." I glanced back at Ben, whose face was pale. His lips parted as if he too was grasping the enormity of what was happening. "I don't know if we can do this, Sarah," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't think we're ready." "You don't need to be ready," Sarah said softly, "but you need to be brave. You need to face it. It feeds off fear. The more afraid you are, the stronger it gets." I could feel it then. The fear crawling back into me, rising up like an insidious tide, choking my thoughts. But there was something else too, a flicker of defiance. This thing, this presence, wasn't going to win. Not if I had any say in it. Okay, I said, determination hardening my voice. I'm ready. There was a pause on the other end. Are you sure? Because once you face it, you can't walk away. You'll have to confront it for good. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I'm sure. Sarah gave me a single piece of advice. Go to the place where it started, where it first made contact. The hollow path. It won't stop until you face it there, where it knows you, where it marked you. I closed my eyes, feeling a shiver run down my spine. The forest, the hollow path. I had no idea how I was supposed to do this, but I knew Sarah was right. We couldn't keep running. We'll do it, I said, my voice firm. Good luck, Sarah replied, and the line went dead. I turned to Ben. We have to go back. He looked at me, fear and confusion still clouding his eyes. But there was something else now, an understanding. We couldn't stay here. We couldn't keep pretending that whatever was following us wasn't real. Let's do it, he said, determination in his voice. And with that, we prepared ourselves for the journey back into the forest. The hollow path, where it all began. I wasn't sure how we would survive this. I wasn't sure what we were about to face. But I knew one thing for certain. We couldn't run anymore. The drive back to Oregon felt endless. The road stretched out ahead of us like a ribbon of asphalt, leading us back to the place we had both tried so desperately to escape. The silence in the car was thick, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I glanced at Ben occasionally, his knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel. His face was a mask of concentration, but I could see the fear flickering behind his eyes. We hadn't spoken much since we decided to leave the safety of the city behind and head back to the forest. I could sense that Ben was questioning the decision. Hell, I was too. But there was no turning back now. Sarah's words echoed in my mind. You need to face it. The hollow path, I had no idea what I was walking into. But I knew that whatever waited for us there, we had to confront it. And if we didn't, it might never leave us. The hours dragged on, each mile closer to the forest tightening the knot in my stomach. The last time I'd been here, everything had been so calm, so normal. I thought the woods were just woods, beautiful but ordinary. Now everything about them felt sinister. The trees, the air, the very ground beneath my feet seemed to hum with a hidden, dangerous energy. As we neared the trailhead, the familiar sense of dread washed over me. The forest loomed before us, thick and unwelcoming. The trees swayed in the wind, their branches creaking, like they were alive, like they were waiting. I could feel it, the presence, the thing that had been following us, watching us, stalking us in the shadows. It was here, in this forest, and it had never left. Ben stopped the car at the edge of the trail, his eyes scanning the darkened woods. You sure about this? He asked, his voice strained. We can still turn back. I hesitated. For a moment, I wondered if we were making a mistake, if there was still time to turn around. But the thought of going back to the apartment, of hiding from this thing, filled me with even more dread. I knew we couldn't run anymore. We had to face it once and for all. I'm sure, I said, my voice firmer than I felt. We have to go. We can't let it keep following us. Ben nodded slowly and opened his door. We both stepped out into the cool night air, the forest seemingly holding its breath as we moved toward the trailhead. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the path, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched closely. We walked in silence, the sound of our footsteps muffled by the damp earth beneath us. The air was thick with tension, each crack of a twig or rustle of leaves making my heart skip a beat. The forest felt alive, not in the way nature is alive, but in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. Like it was aware of us, like it was waiting for us to make the wrong move. At first, it was just the usual unsettling feeling. The quiet whispers of the wind, the odd rustling in the underbrush. But soon, the sensation of being watched grew more intense, like something was just beyond the trees, following our every move. I could almost hear it, the soft shuffle of footsteps, the slow, deliberate pacing of something or someone just out of sight. Ben stopped suddenly, his eyes darting to the right. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I listened closely, holding my breath. There was something out there, something moving in the dark. But it wasn't the wind or the usual forest sounds. This was different. It was deliberate, controlled. A voice, low and almost imperceptible, whispered through the trees. Come closer. Asterisk. My heart stopped. Ben's hand shot out and gripped my arm. His face pale as he whispered, "It's here. It's not just the wind." I turned to him, panic rising in my chest. "What is it? What's out there?" Ben's eyes were wide with fear, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "I don't know, but I don't think we should find out." But it was too late. The moment we'd stepped back into the forest, we had already crossed a line. Whatever had been following us wasn't going to stop until we confronted it. Until we understood what it wanted. The forest felt suffocating now, pressing in on all sides, the trees closing in like silent sentinels. I could feel the pressure building in the air, like a storm was coming. I didn't know what was going to happen next, but I knew one thing. We were no longer alone. Another whisper came, louder this time, clearer. Come back to the path. My skin prickled, and I felt a cold chill sweep over me, as if the forest itself had just exhaled. I turned to Ben, my voice barely a whisper. "The hollow path. It's calling us." Ben's eyes widened with understanding. "But that's where..." I didn't need him to finish. I knew where the path led. The hollow path was where I had first felt the presence, where I had made contact with the thing that was now hunting us. We had to go back there. We had no choice. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was ahead. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, pulling us forward, urging us deeper into the forest. We didn't speak again, but we both knew what we had to do. We were walking into the heart of the unknown. The hollow path. It was waiting for us. The hollow path lay ahead of us, a dark corridor of trees stretching into the unknown. The whispers in the wind had grown into a chant now, a low hum that reverberated through the trees, drawing us forward, urging us deeper. My body was trembling with fear, but I couldn't stop. The pull was too strong. We had come too far to turn back now. Ben and I moved through the underbrush in silence, the tension hanging heavy in the air. Each step felt like an eternity, the forest pressing in around us, its branches reaching out like skeletal hands, brushing against our skin, brushing against our fears. And then it happened. We reached a clearing. The air was thick with a stifling silence, as if the forest had held its breath, waiting for us. The ground beneath our feet was soft, spongy, like it had been soaked with something. Something ancient star. In the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, cracked and worn by time, covered in moss. It was here, in this place, that it all began. "Is this?" Ben's voice faltered, and I could see the same fear in his eyes that I felt in my chest. He didn't need to finish. We both knew. This was where I had felt the presence for the first time. The hollow path, the thing that stalked us, had been waiting for us here, and now there was nowhere left to run. A cold wind swept through the clearing, and I heard the voice again, louder, stronger. "You shouldn't have come back." Asterisk. I looked around frantically, but there was nothing. No shape, no shadow. But I felt it. It was close. It was all around us. Ben pulled me closer, his grip tight on my arm. What do we do now? His voice was barely audible, filled with fear. I don't know, I whispered, the realization settling in like a weight on my chest. But we have to make it stop. We have to face it. Now. Suddenly, the air around us grew heavier, thickening with an unnatural energy. The whispers intensified, swirling around us, becoming maddening, suffocating. It felt like the very earth beneath our feet was alive, breathing, shifting. And then, in the center of the clearing, something began to take shape. A shadow, blacker than the night. It seemed to rise from the earth itself, pulling itself up from the ground like it was being summoned. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, its shape humanoid but twisted, its limbs too long, its head bent at an unnatural angle. It was cloaked in darkness, the air around it rippling with a coldness that could freeze your soul. It was here. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come. Asterisk, the voice said again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a command, deep and resonant, vibrating in the very air. I stepped forward, my heart pounding, my breath shallow, but I knew what I had to do. Couldn't let it win. I had to understand what it wanted, why it was following me, why it had chosen me. Asterisk, why are you following me? What do you want? Asterisk, I demanded, my voice shaking but defiant. The figure's dark eyes fixed on me, and I felt a sharp pang of cold, like 1,000 knives piercing my chest. The air around it hummed with power, and for a moment I thought I might collapse. But I held firm. Asterisk, I am the forest, asterisk. The thing replied, its voice reverberating like a storm. Asterisk, I am the forgotten things. The things that live in the dark places, in the corners of the earth where the light never touches. You called me with your curiosity, with your desire to understand. And now, you will understand what it means to belong to the wild asterisk. A chill ran down my spine. I had thought I could control it, that I could make it stop with logic and reason. But the thing in front of me was no longer something I could explain away. It was something old, older than time, older than any of us. I didn't have the answers, and I never would. But as the cold wind picked up and the darkness closed in, I knew that I couldn't run anymore. The only choice left was to face it. Asterisk, then I will face you, asterisk, I said, my voice firm now. Asterisk, but you don't control me. You don't control us, asterisk. There was a long pause. The figure's eyes seemed to narrow, the darkness around it swirling like a storm. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, it began to fade, melting into the night. The whispers ceased. The forest fell silent. The weight of the moment hung in the air for what felt like hours, until Ben finally let out a shaky breath. Is it over? I didn't know, but I had the sense that whatever this thing was, it wasn't finished. Not with us, not with me. It would always be a part of me now, something I could never outrun. The hollow path wasn't just a trail in the woods. It was a doorway to something deeper, something darker. And no matter how far I ran, it would always be there, waiting. But for now it was silent. Thank you for reading the story. If you enjoyed it and want to experience more chilling tales, be sure to subscribe for more horror stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat. Don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button and join us for the next terrifying adventure.